Alrighty, well, hello everyone, and welcome to Global 360, the show produced by the Washington Diplomat, which for over 25 years has served as the premier source of news and information for the diplomatic community here in DC. I want to thank our sponsors today, Sahori Insurance, which has been serving the diplomatic community for over 50 years, as well as Cigna, a global health services company that operates worldwide. I am Anna Gawel, a managing editor of The Diplomat, and I want to introduce my esteemed co-host, political analyst Eric Ham. Hi, Eric.
Hi, Anna. Although I'm pretty sure after today's discussion, I won't be so esteemed, but thank you anyway for the compliment.
So for anyone that tuned in early, we were a bit live, and you might have gotten a preview of today's show. We are... Eric and I normally are on the same page politically. One of the many reasons I like you, Eric, and again, we'll see by the end of this episode. But we differ on the topic that we're going to explore today, which is how much influence and power former President Trump will have moving forward the next 4 years. So we've already said, this is going to put CNN Crossfire to shame. We're ready for a grudge match. This will eventually be a podcast, which will still be good. But if you're on the webcast, you can see our mean facial expression. So, it's really going to be a visceral show. So anyway, welcome. Let's get serious for a moment. It has been a while since Eric and I did a show together. The last one was, oh my gosh, late December, I think. We talked a lot about the claims of election fraud, voter fraud, and that obviously seems like ages ago. I would be remiss, obviously, if I did not bring up the events of January 6th. I have written extensively about it. Eric, I know your voice has probably gone hoarse analyzing it on air. So I know a lot has already been said about it, but really, I think we can't emphasize enough. It was a very sad episode in the nation's history, and a sadly predictable one as well, based on months and months of, really lies. And I think, as you know, Eric, we as journalists, understandably are wary of using very loaded terms like lies. But, what started off in the beginning of legitimately wanting to have hand recounts of close contests, really quickly devolved into widely debunked, conspiracy theories that just went into the realm of the ridiculous. And I think it's good that journalists right off the bat embrace the term insurrection, because that's what it was on January 6th. And I think on that note, I want to talk about what really amazes me. There is this difference between Democrats and Republicans when it comes to elections in our modern history. We know that the Electoral College kind of gives Republicans a built-in advantage, and a Republican presidential candidate has not won the popular vote other than one time over 30 plus years. In that time, you've had two Democratic candidates win the popular vote, but lose the election, yet accept the results. And even in a case where you had Bush versus Gore, there were questionable decisions made by GOP election officials where you could have really contested that. But Al Gore accepted the Supreme Court decision, moved on. Hillary Clinton won by over 3 million more votes. She promptly conceded, called President Trump. President Obama promptly began the transition process. Nowhere did Democrats, nowhere did these candidates decide to, bring out, question the system. Nowhere were Democratic voters calling for, a mass civil war. And here now we still have GOP lawmakers who are, introducing a slew of voter, quote unquote, tightening the rules for voting, suppressing the rules depending on your viewpoint, saying that all they want to do is instill confidence back into the election system, when it was really them that shredded that confidence. And I mean, we all know that many GOP lawmakers knew after a while that Trump had lost, yet still delayed admitting it. And this, they bear some responsibility in perpetuating the false hopes of many Republican voters. And so this gets to my case one argument here of, most polls have shown, and this was even before and after January 6th, that depending on the poll, you have roughly 60 to 70% of Republicans who still believe that the election was unfair and that Biden won unfairly. And now this is not, we're not talking about the QAnon quacks. And I think, again, let's not mince words. These are quacks, who believe that, Hillary and Tom Hanks drink the blood of children and, and all of this nonsense. We're talking about average Republicans who still, after months, hundreds of fellow Republican election officials, conservative judges appointed by Trump, confirming the validity of these results. I mean, they can go online and literally, if they've got 12 hours, watch a hand recount themselves, still not believing this. And to me, I remember right when the insurrection happened, I wrote about it shortly afterward, and you had commentators left and right saying, this is the definitive end of Donald Trump. I mean, how can a president incite an insurrection and survive it? And I said, this is not the end. He is not going anywhere because his base is not going anywhere. And it's actually much wider than a lot of people appreciate. So that is kind of my first thing. And then my second thing is, then we had the impeachment trial. And, on the one hand, I think Democrats did an effective job of connecting the dots between these, months of baseless allegations, incendiary rhetoric, and what led up to the events of January 6th. But I also think the trial, one of the more consequential things that came out of it, and that I hope will continue to be investigated, is what Trump knew and when did he know it that day. And I think to most common sense observers, we're aware that President Trump was aware of what was taking place on the Capitol. Beyond the fact that he has the best security and intelligence, in the world. I mean, it was plastered on TV. He watches TV all the time. We know that he called Senator Tommy Tuberville. So he was informed that Mike Pence was not only still in the building, but was being evacuated. His concern, his first thoughts were not, attempting to be concerned about the safety of those inside, including Republicans and his vice president. He was wondering if senators would still overturn the results of the Electoral College. Multiple reports have indicated that he was confused as to why other people weren't thrilled that, a mob had breached the U.S. Capitol. And I think one of the more powerful arguments we heard in the trial, the impeachment trial, was Democratic Representative Castro saying, that President Trump left everyone in the Capitol to die. Now, whether you agree with that statement or not, I think it's common sense to agree with Mitch McConnell, who said President Trump was the only one who had the power to stop this. He is the commander in chief. He could have stopped the riot if he'd wanted to, but he did not. And to me, that constitutes, a dereliction of duty of such magnitude that it puts these kind of fabricated scandals like Benghazi to shame. And yet, and here's my long-winded second point, you still have, even after this revelation, you have polls, multiple polls showing not a decrease in support for Trump, but an increase. I mean, one of the more recent ones, USA Today, showed that 42% of Republicans said the trial made them more supportive of Trump. You have, again, the 70% figure is not adjusted in terms of how many Republicans think the election was unfair. You have over 70% of Republicans say that those who voted to impeach Trump were disloyal. And as you know, many of those now have a target on their backs for primaries. Sure. Up to 50% of Republicans have said they would consider joining a party created by Donald Trump. And roughly the support for establishment figures like Mitch McConnell, Liz Cheney tends to hover around 20%. I mean, so now you have a party where the establishment figures are in the minority. I mean, Mitch McConnell, who didn't vote for impeachment, no fan, I don't think, of Donald Trump, but didn't vote for impeachment. He's not going to commit political suicide by alienating the 74 million people that did vote for Donald Trump. I mean, it's not something we can easily forget. And even though President Trump left office with very low approval ratings, he remains relatively unpopular with the majority of Americans. He is incredibly popular with the majority of Republicans. And that is a huge conundrum, an existential one for the party. I do think that the GOP has become the party of Trump. I think we're going to see it, and I know you're going to talk a lot about it at the CPAC conference on Sunday. His big return. He is going to declare himself as, as Axios and others have reported, the presumptive Republican candidate for 2024. And I think all indications, barring, sickness or a prison sentence, I think that my bet is that Donald Trump is the Republican to beat 4 years from now, and he's itching for it and he's excited for it. I don't know if I'm excited, but that's my prediction. Boom. I've laid my cards out on the table, Eric. You go.
Okay, where do I begin?
Oh.
Okay, well, let's start with the aftermath of the insurrection, and let's look at two consequential states that were consequential in the election in 2020 and will be consequential not only in 2022 but also in 2024. That's Pennsylvania and Arizona. We know both of those states in the aftermath of the insurrection have seen a wholesale defection of Republicans from the party. In fact, at least 10,000 have left both Pennsylvania Republican Party and the Arizona Republican Party. And we know across the country, even more Republicans have left the party wholesale. Now that's pretty startling and pretty shocking when in the immediate aftermath of an election, you see tens of thousands of people actually take the time to officially switch their party affiliation. That means these are people who are motivated to not vote Republican. And so when we're talking about a party where, as you mentioned, they have lost the majority in in all but one presidential election in the last 3 decades, this is a party that is dwindling and simply it does not have the bandwidth to be able to compete at the national level. So that's one of the problems that this party is facing. The other, I think, is the conundrum of, do you want 100% of nothing or do you want 50% of something? And so, yes, former President Trump is going to declare himself the de facto leader of the Republican Party, of the GOP. But what does that get him? And what does that mean that he is now the de facto leader of a party that we are seeing is dwindling, is actually going the way of the Whig Party? Because already we saw when he ran for office in 2016, as you mentioned, he did not win the popular vote then, and he lost in 2020. So he came in without the popular vote in 2016, he lost by 3 million votes. In 2018, we saw Democrats take back control of the House of Representatives. In 2020, we saw him lose the presidency, and we saw the Senate, we saw the Republicans lose the Senate. And oh, by the way, Democrats picked up states like Georgia and Arizona, along with winning back those key states, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania in the presidential election. And so I think what you're seeing here is, with tens of thousands fleeing the party, with the party already struggling with being able to attract new people, I think it's only going to become increasingly difficult for this party to be able to compete at the national level. Also, we have to take into account, in the aftermath of the insurrection, a large amount of blue chip companies announced that they will no longer be supporting any Republican who voted to not ratify the 2020 election. So what that means is, now when we're talking these races for the White House, the House, and the Senate, when you look at the enormous amount of money that these candidates need to raise in order to win, it's going to be that much more difficult for Republicans to be able to compete. And we cannot discount the fact that as an incumbent, Donald Trump was outraised by Joe Biden in the 2020 election. Also, we have to take into account the biggest donor to the Republican Party passed away in 2020, Sheldon Adelson, who raised and who supported the party and the president with more than $100 million in 2020 alone. In fact, he gave, I think it was close to 90 million in the final weeks of the campaign. That money is gone now. Not to mention the Koch brothers, who also had a falling out with Trump even before the 2018 midterms, sat on the sidelines then and also sat on the sidelines in 2020. So now you have these blue chip companies that have already said they will no longer support any of these candidates who voted to not ratify the election in 2020, major donors of the party who are no longer supporting the Republican Party. And oh, by the way, the National Rifle Association, one of the biggest supporters that's now struggling to be able to stay afloat, they certainly will not be a major player like they were in previous elections. I think the issue of this party being able to raise money and to compete has only become increasingly more difficult. And while the president will certainly use his political action committee and the thought and idea of him running in 2024 as a way to raise money for himself, it simply will not be enough for him to be able to compete at the national level, let alone what it will mean for the party down ballot. So I think what we're seeing here is a party that has very much a Donald Trump problem because they cannot raise money to be competitive. And oh, by the way, we have yet to see Donald Trump, even though he got 74 million votes, we have yet to see him be able to actually win a popular vote, which actually goes a long way in securing the Electoral College. And also, as you mentioned, the president left office with a very, very low approval rating, one of the lowest in history. I think what that speaks to is just how toxic he is. So when you talk about when you need not only centrist Republicans, but also those all important independents, not to mention those suburban white women, I think it's going to only make it that much more difficult for this president to not only bring others along, but also to be able to get himself elected. And oh, by the way, we just heard today, David Perdue, who ran and lost in Georgia in that Senate runoff to Joel Ossoff, had filed paperwork to run against Raphael Warnock in 2022, has now decided that he is not running because when he went to kiss the ring of Donald Trump in
I'm glad
Florida,
you said kiss the ring because I forgot to say that one and I just love the phrase. So yeah, I'm glad you brought that up.
So when he was there to kiss the ring, our reports are telling us all he talked about was retribution that he wanted on the party. You cannot be a viable party if you are so focused on tearing the party down, tearing down that apparatus that you so desperately need in order to get you back in the win column. And I think just as we saw with that insurrection on the Capitol that has made the United States weaker as a nation, Donald Trump's efforts to continue to fight against his own party is going to make the party that much weaker as a political apparatus, and it's going to make it that much more difficult for both himself and for down ballot candidates to be successful both in 2022 and in 2024.
All right, I'm gearing up here. All great points, Eric. Now let me explain why I'm right. No. No, you know, there are a lot of points where we overlap on. You know, I think it's difficult too, because on the one hand, and we know this with polls, I mean, on the one hand, you know, you can cite that thousands have left the party, but I can also cite, you know, you mentioned Arizona. That's the state of Jeff Flake, who we know his fate when he tried to cross Trump. And I think the real test will start to come in these primaries. And, you know, I'll get to this point later, but, you know, primaries tend to bring out your more vocal or extreme base. And that already kind of has where Trump has that advantage. But I wanted to go into an interesting point that you mentioned, which was financing and the corporations that have kind of stepped back because of this. You know, on the one hand, I wanted to say what I thought was interesting is that corporations are bringing up or forcing the kind of accountability that Congress has not been able to. I mean, you look at Sidney Powell, Rudy Giuliani, the attorneys who perpetuated, a whole, as Dominion and Smartmatic, the voting companies have said, an entire disinformation campaign of completely debunked, conspiracy theories. They're now facing multi-billion-dollar lawsuits. Trump potentially could as well. I think he probably will. And, in this way, corporations, and now you've got the My Pillow guy facing a multi-billion-dollar lawsuit. In this way, the corporations are holding people accountable for these lies. And there's a certain reassuring element that you can't just, as an influential person, go out and say, hey, we won this landslide victory when you lost, actually. There have to be some kind of repercussions. That said, I think, we journalists and pundits put a lot of emphasis on fundraising, which of course you have to have if you're going to run for office in America. That's a given. But we have to also remember that Hillary outraised Trump 4 years ago. And you have to look at also when these legal challenges came up, it motivated his base to to donate tens of millions of dollars, most of which did not go to actual legal challenges. So now Trump is sitting pretty on, a cushy bank of donations, right, to begin with, just because he brought up the issue of election fraud and his voters bought into it and gave a lot of money for it. I think, the biggest thing of what you discussed brings for me to mind a fundamental problem in the system. You talked about the influence, nationally, but the issue nationally is the Electoral College. Not just that, but coupled with the fact that Republicans have built-in advantages where even if they represent the minority, they have been given majority power positions. Now, we know that the Senate is disproportionately set up to benefit rural, small states, which, over the years since the 1960s have become predominantly Republican. Now, that is what the Constitution essentially intended. But the Electoral College, and we could have, the most boring webcast on the planet of the historical, reasons behind the Electoral College, but there's a lot of myths and misconceptions about it. But it really comes down to, it was not meant, like, as people said, to kind of keep, the minority empowered. The minority was not meant to win every single presidential election. But this is what we're seeing. And I think this is part of where my cynicism comes from, where even if Trump is not liked by the majority of Americans, he's still perfectly capable of winning. Now, Biden had a healthy victory in terms of the Electoral College, but it was not this massive landslide that would necessarily be commensurate with his popular vote of 7 million more popular votes. And here, I think, if you're a Democrat, you got to get to the issue of the Electoral College. Democrats face a much higher hurdle. And this is only going to be compounded by the demographics that we're seeing as more and more people move to urban areas like New York, California. These states are always going to be blue. But now, these swing states account for, a voter in a swing state has 10 times the power of a voter in Maryland. This is the system that we have set up. And I think now on top of that, you have gerrymandering. Republicans have, latched onto it first. They're much better at it. It's not to say Democrats don't do it, but let's face it, Republicans are much more better at it. You have the census. They control the majority of state houses. There's going to be more gerrymandering. There's now talk of, Republicans stacking local judges that could implement election rules. And of course, we're seeing, I think in 33 states or something like that, where Republicans are introducing laws to curtail mail-in balloting. I think a particularly offensive one is to not allow early voting on Sunday, which is typically when African-American communities do voting drives, but you allow it on Saturday and Monday, which just makes no sense. They're going to make it much, much harder for the segments that typically vote Democrat to vote. And again, they control about 60% of state houses. So even if, as you said, and I do agree, Trump is causing a huge schism, a much more existential schism in the Republican Party than what we hear about progressives versus moderates in the Democratic Party. But the system is built in at the moment to reward the minority and to reward the vocal minority that goes out there, hogs the microphone, and votes more. And these are all elements that will be to Trump's advantage.
I just can't say that.
What? I have like statistics from like 8 years ago. If I need to, I will whip them out.
Okay, well, you better bring them all in here, because I just don't see that playing out for Donald Trump. And the reason for that is because here's is the problem that he's going to run into in 4 years. It's the same problem that Mitt Romney had when he ran against Barack Obama in 2012. Mitt Romney got the same percentage of the white vote that Ronald Reagan got in 1980. Ronald Reagan won in a landslide. Mitt Romney lost. And what that speaks to is just how rapidly the demographics in this country are changing. And just to give an example of how that is playing out, just recently, there were two big victories that Texas was celebrating. Yes, Texas. And that is the fact that Oracle has announced that they are moving their corporate headquarters from California to Texas, and that Elon Musk is also moving to Texas. And I know Texas is like very ecstatic about that, but you know what that actually means? That means those liberal voters who lived in California are now moving even faster to Texas, which I believe Texas by 2024 will be undoubtedly blue. I think Texas is gone. In fact, you can take Texas off the red column.
That's a bold one. Ooh,
that's a very bold statement, but Texas was already moving in that direction. And I think these two moves, not only that, but we cannot discount what is happening with the pandemic. And we see this with the pandemic. People are fleeing California and New York even faster. They just simply aren't going back there. They want to be in much open spaces. They want to be in places where the cost of living is not as high. And so where are they going? They are going, Californians are largely going to Arizona and Texas, which is why Arizona has already made the shift. I mean, for the first time, you've got 2 Democratic senators there. And Texas, I think it's on its way. It's going to get there even faster. And for New Yorkers, they are going to places like Georgia, in the Atlanta area, which is why we have seen Georgia turn blue, and they're going to North Carolina, which we saw North Carolina go blue during the Obama years, and many thought that it would stay there, much like Virginia did. But I think those demographic shifts also, because, and this is probably the only place where we will talk about the Latino vote not in a monolithic way, because we have to be honest. Dominicans do not vote the same way that Cubans vote, the same way that Mexicans vote. But typically in the media, we lump them all together. But that's not the case, because if you look at how Cubans vote in South Florida, it's very different from how Latinos vote in Arizona. And that's what we saw. That's what we saw take place in this election. And so I think it's those demographic shifts that are going to do unchangeable damage, not only to Donald Trump's efforts, if he in fact tries to run in 4 years, but also to the party, because you're just going to have a vastly different demographic. And we see that happening. We see that playing out because the Republican Party is now becoming far more whiter, far less diverse. And also it's a much older demographic, and every single year they lose population, which hurts them at the ballot box. And I think it's only going to get worse in 4 years. It's not going to get better for them. So that's something that's something they cannot account for. That's something they cannot change for, which is why we see this over-reliance on voter suppression, because they have decided we're not going to create this open tent environment. We are just going to try to suppress as much of the vote as we can, because they recognize they simply cannot win by having everyone vote.
Right. No, and now I'm not with you on the Texas, that
Oh,
vote
no one
prediction.
is. But Texas is gone. Texas is gone.
we're going to replay this in 4 years when we are nationally syndicated and we have millions of people watching, and we will see who's right. We'll have some,
and they're going to say that guy was a genius.
We'll see. We'll have a wager on it. We'll see. But I do agree, and I think you bring up a good point that a lot of pundits kind of tend to miss is demographics are so nuanced. A lot of people well, Trump won the white vote, and they instantly we'll see because because undercurrents of racism and all of these. But we do have to remember that a lot of that white vote went to Obama. So we can't just, again, say that the white vote is monolithic. Likewise, as you said, Latinos had a strong turnout of Latinos who voted for President Trump. So, demographics are so much more nuanced than people give them credit for. Although I will say, again, even if you have states, North Dakota or what have you, where the population is shrinking, they still have the same electoral college count. And therein goes back to my, point of, even if you have these demographic shifts, and some of it, yes, definitely moving to Texas, moving to a lot of Midwestern states, which could alter really significantly alter the demographics. But, fundamentally, you have a lot of these states with this outsized influence. And even if, voters kind of scatter, North Dakota is going to be Republican, and they're still going to get their electoral college results in. I mean, until you have one person, one vote system, the politics of it don't necessarily reflect majority opinion. So that's my concern. But, I wanted to bring up, since you mentioned the Latino vote, and I think what's interesting, when they did a lot of surveys, a lot of, Latinos approved of Trump's law and order message. And this almost goes, you're the one who brought this up, I think, at our last show. And, it's sometimes counterintuitive, but because you think, oh, well, here President Trump railed against, immigration, called Mexicans rapists and all of this, and he's done well. So again, as you said, not monolithic. And I think I wanted to touch on immigration because to me, this gets to the bigger point that the next 4 years, Trump will go back to what he did successfully in 2016. And he will tap into these kind of cultural wedge issues. He doesn't need to have any facts or substance behind it. He didn't in 2016. He certainly doesn't now. He just needs to throw it out there. Like you said, he is built to attack, built to destroy, not rebuild, divide, not unite. That has worked successfully for him. And I think now you're going to see in the next 4 years, he's got a chip on his shoulder, but he's also going to be energized. I see Trump in his element. He's got all of the trappings of power without the kind of pain in the butt nuances of government. I know, I say, I know, but he's gonna get to go to maskless conventions and bask in the adulation of his supporters and not have to deal with his critics. He's gonna do exactly what he loves to do, which is get payback and vengeance on the people who have, the lawmakers who have voted against him. He can devote his energy solely to that. And I think this gets to, and I want to hear your opinion on this because it deals with the media. You're going to, for the next 4 years, have this study in contrast between Biden and Trump. We know Biden is basically back to normal. He's presidential. I mean, we see President Trump golfing, which he did 1/5 of his presidency. You have Joe Biden holding a vigil for, 500,000 Americans who died of the coronavirus. This is not, whereas President Trump never acknowledged any of these deaths. You have President Biden, on his daily schedule, just getting intel briefings, working Congress to push through his stimulus package. You have him at night, bringing files home to read, not watching Fox News and tweeting grievances and, and outlandish things. And, you also have reaching out like Obama did to average Americans every night and all of this. You have what is a functioning presidency, but that can be normal. And eventually normal translates into boring. And I just wonder, obviously Trump lost his megaphone with Twitter, but he's going to have a megaphone. He's not going to go quietly into, the golf resort life. I mean, he is still going to say outrageous things, and he's going to latch on every complex topic that comes up, like immigration. It served him well. And so I just wonder if the media will be able to resist the temptation of giving Trump some kind of coverage after Biden does all the tedious, boring work of government. There just comes a point. Biden is not, it's funny to me that Republicans call him radical. He's one of the most boring consensus builders in politics. I mean, this guy is not the last thing you would call radical. And I feel the same way about voters, where eventually these empty sound bites and sensationalism that Trump really relishes and perfects will resonate with voters more than the substance of what Biden and the complexities of what he's going to tackle. And that's another reason why I just think over 4 years, Trump kind of has that advantage of still having a megaphone, even though he won't have Twitter.
I don't see how you can say he has a megaphone when he doesn't have access to social media, which was the primary vehicle that he used to communicate with his millions of followers. So he doesn't have the same megaphone that any ex-president would have, because he doesn't have access to his favorite medium of social media. So I don't see how he has, so to say he has a megaphone is to say that I have a megaphone. It just doesn't exist for him.
Because you do Global 360.
Well, he doesn't do Global 360, and then he's barred from social media. So yes, my reach is actually greater than his, because when we get done with this, I can go tweet this on Twitter. He cannot. So this access to this megaphone that you say he has, it just does not exist.
I see Parler coming back. I don't see Parler being able to resist the money, the lure.
Okay, let's say he goes to Parler. Now, I will say this. I do believe that a traditional media infrastructure is set up to follow every word that comes out of Donald Trump's mouth. But I don't believe the American people are going to compare a Joe Biden to a Donald Trump. I think people are going to look at Donald Trump for who and for what he is. And I do believe millions of Americans are still going to be scarred from this dark moment in time, where by the time it's over, we will probably see more than 600,000 people dead from this pandemic, the pandemic that President Trump refused to even acknowledge was in existence. And so I think that is going to be a massive weight around his neck, much like Iraq and Afghanistan were around Republicans. And I think that's going to just make it that much more difficult. So when you take into account the pandemic, when you take into account his lack of social media access, and when you take into account, and yes, I will say this, his difficulty to be able to raise money to compete at a presidential level. Again, we're talking, you're going to need $1 billion. I don't know if Trump has the bandwidth among his followers to raise $1 billion, because if he did, he would have been on parity with Joe Biden in 2020, but yet he wasn't. So I don't think he has the ability to raise that kind of money. And oh, by the way, we're talking not only what you do at the top of the ticket, but also what takes place down ballot. I just don't see the Republican Party being at the level of strength they're going to need to be with a Donald Trump at the top of the ticket for him or any of them to be successful. I just don't see it, because they don't have the tools in order to be competitive, especially with a Donald Trump. And you know what, Anna? We have not even talked about the massive criminal and civil liability facing Donald Trump now. This is a man who is literally, Donald Trump has dealt with civil litigation his entire adult life, but now he's staring down the barrel of 2 criminal investigations, both have merit, and both
Mhm.
could see him tied up for the foreseeable future. And not only that, Anna, but we're talking as of right now, we're talking at least 4 different cases that I see, 2 criminal, 2 civil, and 4 different jurisdictions, which means you need 4 different sets of lawyers to represent you on all of this. And I don't care how much money he is raising from these followers of his, it's still not going to be enough to cover all of these legal expenses, because more than anything, he's got to stay out of prison.
Well, and you know, and I did mention that in the beginning as like a asterisk, but as you said, that is a huge asterisk.
That's a big blankety blank asterisk, because yeah, that is so massive, and I think that will ultimately be Donald Trump's downfall, because now we know his accounting firm is turning over those records to the Manhattan District Attorney this week.
Right. Yes, and I mean, way to end it on, you know, what do they call it? Cliff. Yeah, boom, mic drop. Well, no, I'm gonna get the mic back, but no, it's true, and I don't think Rudy Giuliani will be available to represent him, because he's got a few legal issues of his own to deal with. So you know, he's running out of lawyers here.
Yeah, he's gonna need real criminal attorneys, because look. Just to go on the air, I had to listen to I had to listen to the entire phone call that he had with Georgia Secretary of State Bill Ratzenberger. That was a very, very, I think, incriminating phone call. And I'm not a lawyer, but I saw so much wrong with that phone call. I'm surprised that those around him allowed him to actually take that to speak.
You know, and I think this gets to a lot of the election fraud. A lot of people might not realize a lot of these election fraud charges at the state level can be misdemeanors. So as egregious as I think that should be, a president trying to bully election officials into finding votes, that might be a misdemeanor. But as you say, the real issue will be what's coming largely out of Manhattan. It will be his financial dealings, which he has had issues with his whole life, his whole career. There have been a lot of questions. He's been able to tamp down on it, but like you said, the next 4 years, he will be bogged down in, trying not to go to jail, in essence. And I almost think, you brought up, and we have a diplomatic audience of, you need $1 billion to run a campaign. That in and of itself is also a entire episode, which is a sad state of affairs, because a lot of other countries, like, we need $1 billion to run a president. Like in Britain, they do that in like 3 weeks. They're like, we're done. We're done. We just spent $50. We're good. So that's a whole other, show. But, I always kind of complain when people do what we did, which is try and predict what's going to happen in 4 years. This is such a unique situation. We've never really had a sitting president who lost and is already trying to claim the mantle 4 years from now. And it's going to be interesting, because you mentioned the pandemic. On the one hand, my cynical side says voters, media have very short attention spans. But on the flip side, I will say, if Joe Biden, if his rescue package works, if we're able to beat the virus and return to some kind of normal as he's projected by the end of the year, that will be his legacy. And I do think that could carry him over 3 years, 4 years from now. But so much can happen in the meantime as well, which is something neither of us talked about, the unknown unknowns or what have you. So it's also,
you're right. But if Biden gets past this pandemic and he brings this economy back, I mean,
it's done.
He will be like a New York quarterback who has won the Super Bowl. I mean, he can do whatever he wants. If he wants to walk off into the sunset, he's happy to do it. If he wants to run another 4 years, he can do that too.
I'm going to go ahead and end it right there, because you're trying to bring sports analogies, knowing that I don't watch sports. And so, no, I can stick with obscure statistics. You start talking about sports, and you have me on the losing end. So no, I'm gonna cut this off right here. But anyway, it will be interesting to see how these how our projections, which this time we're strong. We laid it down.
Can I
laid
just say
all
one?
our cards on the table.
We did, but you know what? There's one thing that we did not talk about that is also instrumental to Trump, and that is the nearly $1 billion, the more than $1 billion that he owes over the next 4 years, of which 400 million of that is coming due next year. So we didn't even talk about that and what that means for his trajectory politically, but that's certainly going to be key and also have an impact. But we can save that for another conversation.
I was going to say, and isn't it interesting how money always forces a reckoning with the truth? The power of the purse.
There you go.
Yeah. So we will, of course, I don't think, as I said, former President Trump will go quietly into that good night, but we will in the future obviously be focusing on the current president because he's got plenty on his plate. And of course, that is the pandemic, but there are also a lot of foreign affairs issues that he will have to deal with sooner rather than later, Iran and China and a whole mix of things. So we will be getting back to kind of our bread and butter, so to speak. And hopefully we'll have more disagreements because I thought this was pretty fun.
I loved every minute of it.
I know. I won't say who won. I think it was me, but it's okay. So we'll let you guys be the judge, and we're going to be available if you missed this. We will be sending information out. You can always rewatch our grudge match. Watch diplomat.com. You can download us as a podcast, Global 360 on Apple, Android, or Spotify. We of course want to thank our sponsors, Cigna Global Health Services Company, as well as Sahori Insurance, and want to thank everybody who joined us. And thank you, Eric, for a fair fight. Until the next time.
Look forward to it. Thanks so much, Anna. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.